So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Welcome, Marium, Vahed, Green Ummah. Welcome to the podcast, and looking forward to discussing your great work. So, for our audience, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and Green Ummah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, assalamu alaikum, everyone. My name is Marium Vahed. I'm the chair of a nonprofit organization called Green Ummah that seeks to, develop an environmental movement in the Canadian Muslim community or communities, because we are a very diverse ummah. I guess to introduce myself, I'm a passionate lover of nature, of learning about nature. I'm someone who recently graduated from the University of Toronto studying diaspora and transnational studies and anthropology. And in both those instances, I've had lots of opportunity to do research about the environment and its intersection with, equity, diversity, inclusion, and intersectionality. I'm also someone who's been working in community spaces for quite a number of years. I'm young, but since high school, I've been involved in my community and doing grassroots organizing, especially related to politics and getting out the vote in Canadian Muslim communities.
That's great. And Mariam, with this kind of great work you've been doing from even your high school days, what was your inspiration or role models, or what were things that influenced you that meaningfully inspired you to do the work that you do?
Absolutely. It's a great question, and one that I love to answer. I've been very privileged to be raised by a heavily involved family, and especially two grandmothers who are both matriarchs and a lover of community involvement. So on my dad's side, my dadima, she grew up in apartheid South Africa, and so she was always someone who shared those stories with me of what it was like to live as an Indian woman in that time, and the importance of getting an education for her, the importance of being involved in her community, and of giving back once she came to Canada, and to supporting the nascent growth of the Muslim community in Mississauga and in Ontario, which is where I'm from. So on that side, I definitely was pushed to always think about equity and justice and a pursuit of lifelong learning, as well as service. And then on my mom's side, it was a similar story, but this time in Pakistan. And so I have a grandmother who was an educator and who taught English as a second language. And she similarly really believed in the importance of service and of giving back. And her career as a teacher was the way of doing that. So those are my two role models, and I look up to them a lot, and they're both still around. And so I get lots of great advice from the both of them.
And yes, so the social justice and racial equity, but the environment itself, as we know in the Muslim community, it's maybe on the list of priorities right now. Palestine is at the forefront, Uyghur rights, and Yemen and Syria, many fronts in terms of social justice and racial equity, and many issues pertaining to those pressing causes for the Muslim community. But the environment itself, at least here in British Columbia, it's in the talking points in meetings with the community. The environment has not been referenced as much. And what was the inspiration specifically for the environment? Going to look at this existential crisis that faces everybody, what were the catalysts for you that inspired you to do Green Ummah?
For sure. I mean, I think for my generation, thinking about climate change is at the forefront. It's really hard to ignore that is going to be a reality within our lifetimes. But beyond climate change, I also have a deep love and appreciation and gratitude for nature. Once again, going back to my grandparents, my nana had a green thumb. He had a huge, beautiful garden in the backyard, and I was raised watching him treat nature with so much care. And so, that was something that always stuck with me, and especially throughout my university days, I used it as an opportunity to do research in different community initiatives related to the environment. So I did research on community gardens. I did research on different tours and walks that were happening in Toronto to bring people to appreciate their urban environments and suburban environments. And so that was something that has always stuck with me. And when Adil, who is one of my co-founders of Green Ummah, came up to me and said, hey, why don't we take our history and our knowledge and experience of contributing to grassroots organizing in the Muslim community and bring it to the environmental space. It really felt like a calling of marrying that passion for grassroots work and that love and appreciation for nature, as well as the knowledge that this is one of the issues of our lifetime, and one that we need to address so that we can continue to engage with the beautiful planet that we have as it is.
And the context, as we know, it's a climate emergency.
Yes.
It is an emergency on multiple fronts, and with overfishing, the plastic pollution that's prevalent all over the oceans around the world, and then special interests that are stymieing progress in government around the world that are, either in the meat sector or the forestry sector or the fishing sector that are doing their best with a lot of resources to slow down efforts for reform worldwide. And one of the things we discussed in our previous conversation was mental health, where because the climate emergency is so pressing, and to manage your self-care to kind of look at such an overwhelming problem and work where you can in your own locality, global to local. So informing that, because there's so many diverse topics about the environment and sustainability and renewable energy. Where does Green Ummah, where did you guys get started? And please talk about the initial start of Green Ummah and the scope of your work currently.
Yeah, for sure. So, I mean, we started out of a conversation about how, unfortunately, the environmental movement as it is not very diverse in Canada. There are not all voices that are being heard, and as we know through research done by great thinkers like Ingrid Waldron, environmental racism is something that we experience in Canada, where Black, Indigenous, and racialized communities have to deal with additional burdens related to the environment, be it, increased like dumping areas where they live, be it, not recognizing Indigenous sovereignty and in constructing pipelines, be it even if you look from a global perspective, like worse air pollution in underdeveloped and developing countries. And so we wanted to make sure that the movement in Canada included all of our voices and all of those perspectives. And we were lucky to find someone who really supported that, Nature Canada, and they wanted to make sure that we were being brought into that movement. So that's where we started. It was that conversation of not seeing ourselves in the movement and wanting to ensure that we were part of it. In terms of where it went from there, we realized there was a lot of work that needed to be done on the awareness and education front. There has, of course, been environmental organizers in the Muslim community and work that's been done, and we really respect that work. But unfortunately, when you have conversations with relatives, they don't fully understand, or perhaps they do understand and they don't know what to do with that information. And so we wanted to be a bit of a launching point and address some of those initial questions, think about ways that we can practically involve nature and sustainable living and balance with nature into our lives as that starting point, and then from there build up the organization and build up the movement so that it becomes more about launching Muslim youth and launching youth into the environmental movement with an understanding that we can actually do something about it, with an approach of there are solutions that we can contribute to and we can lead, and we don't need to have so much eco-anxiety. There are positive changes that can be made. And so that's kind of where that went. In terms of what we're doing right now, we're helping develop a curriculum which really, really seeks to educate Muslim youth, but recognize that they're so smart. Like, our Muslim youth are change makers already, and we have so much inspiration from them. And so how do we guide all of their passion and knowledge into an understanding and belief that they can do something about the environment and they can create green communities?
And even from our Islamic perspective, we are in essence vice regents on this world, not only responsible for Muslims and mankind, but the environment itself, which is an amanat, the trust to us that
Sure.
Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us. Now, that in mind, you've come up with some workshops and other initiatives in Ramadan. Let's talk about the workshops you developed and the Ramadan initiative.
Yeah, so we began our organization a couple months before the pandemic hit, and so we had an entirely different plan for a Green Ramadan that was really about going into mosques, speaking to different Muslim nonprofits about how can they change their efforts in Ramadan to be more aware of sustainability, and that's where we started. Unfortunately, with the pandemic, everything changed, and so we shifted our vision and decided, okay, well, why don't we engage people online and create a digital community where people can engage in these discussions about the environment and where they see themselves in the environmental movement. We focused on very practical tips related to water, energy, developing a connection with nature, and food waste. And for each of those different focuses, we spoke about why it's important to think about it, what we can do about it, and what are other organizations that we could amplify who are working in that space. So that's where we started. Recently, we held a conference just a couple months ago where we had, great thinkers from all across Canada and even all across North America who could come and speak to the work that they were doing, so that, our Canadian Muslim populations and communities could see great work has been done, and this is how I can support it. And that was everything from speaking about local initiatives like Studio 89, and they're a small business that really seeks to integrate their principles of sustainability, to thinking more at a level of what can the Ummah do and what are principles in Islam that we can draw from that really help us engage in this environmental advocacy with the idea of being caliphas of this earth.
Absolutely. And one of the key issues, one aspect of the environment is energy, and with coal being one of the most primary energy sources, and the shift to solar and wind and geothermal and other renewable energies. In terms of these type of existential, like big macro issues, which is shifting our whole infrastructure economy wise to renewable energy, um, in terms of even electric cars and many electric car company, or sorry, and many traditional car companies have created mandates by 2025, 2030. They want to shift to electric vehicle production as the primary, and to really completely shift from the internal combustion engine to electric vehicles. Now, in terms of that type of education, that really one of the key issues is energy, and energy is really driving the carbon emissions and global warming. Do you have any workshops to talk about these issues, and even from the next car purchase to really look at these type of sustainable measures in terms of
Yeah, for sure.
transportation?
For sure. I mean, in our Green Ramadan campaign, that was something that we spoke about for a whole week. We spoke about how can we change the way that we approach energy as individuals in our lives. But that systemic piece is so important. We know that when we're seeking to address climate change and our biodiversity crisis, it needs to be something that happens within every single aspect of our lives and systems. That change needs to be it needs to happen within governments, within businesses, within all sectors, including the energy sector. It needs to happen when we think about food waste. Like, these are systemic issues. And so how can we, think about that? How can we find ways of taking action on that? And it's something that we continue as an organization to grow on, because when we started out, we started with a lot of those very basic understandings of like, okay, energy is an important thing to think about, and a shift in our country about the use of fossil fuels and coal and moving towards more sustainable forms of energy. We started at a very basic level, and now as we think about future Ramadans and possibly think about moving to an advocacy space, we're thinking about, okay, now how can we take that understanding and use it to impact how our country's politicians are thinking about energy.
So, like at this moment, awareness and education, and then eventually shifting or complementing that work with advocacy in government and the private sector, to to advocate. And just getting back to education, as you
Mhm.
know, online there's a lot of misinformation, disinformation,
Yes.
and social media has become weaponized by different parties. And as much as we believe there's a climate emergency, there's a whole section of society that doesn't believe it, and they have their quote unquote facts and conspiracies. So, in light of that misinformation and a disagreement on the climate emergency by, I would say, a large population around the world, um, and also in our community,
Sure.
obviously these are challenges. And so, in terms of the educational workshops, have you considered after the lockdown, perhaps workshops in the masajid and other communities, like officially just going in into really from a basic level, as you said, when you started, you had a general understanding, but now as you get deeper and deeper, you realize how multifaceted and intersectional it all is.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, at our current stage, it's so hard to think that we'll soon be back in person. It feels like ages away because we've been dealing with this pandemic for so long. But that was actually the initial vision of Green Ummah, was how can we bring these conversations into our masjids? How can we mobilize our imams and speaking about this in Friday khutbahs? How do we create halakas that are about, environmental principles? And it's something that we'll definitely revisit. But as for the next couple of years, we have really decided to focus on schools, on Islamic schools, but also schools in general, because we know that there are a lot of Muslim youth who are attending like public schools, and we still want to be able to reach them and have support them in having those critical conversations with their peers about Muslims care about the environmental movement needs to be intersectional, and how can we talk about that? And so yeah, that's something that we're currently planning for, both an in-person and for a digital approach.
Absolutely. And in terms of other important things, as we know, our whole lives we've been taught, don't waste water and eat
Mhm.
all the food on your plate and these type of things. Now, food is something that I think a lot of us don't really think too much about. How is this water coming to us, and the different types of food that arrive on our plate? How much energy was expended to bring that piece of steak on our plate, where it's tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of liters of water for just one steer. So in terms of food security and just food in and of itself, as we know, beef is uh, and cattle grazing is one of the biggest causes of greenhouse emissions. What are your thoughts about education, just from even that aspect of food, which is a big part of our lives and a big part of the economy and a big part of the environmental emergency?
For sure. I mean, this is something that I love to talk about because my mom's a nutritionist. And so I was really raised with like a critical awareness of how can we think about our food systems and the food that we eat, and how, the consumer choice really drives industries to change. And I think that that's something that needs to be considered. I know that jumping right to vegetarianism or veganism feels very daunting in our communities, especially because meat can be such a central part of our culture. And I'm not suggesting that, actually. I take more of an approach of, when you're having your weekly meals, how can you reduce the amount of beef that you eat or reduce the amount of fish that you eat? Because we have to recognize that it is having a negative impact on our world. My family, we try to take an approach of like, we're not cutting out beef entirely, but it's a special occasion thing only. So we'll eat beef if it's like Eid or a birthday. But aside from those occasions, we primarily try to eat, you know, vegetables. And there are lots of delicious options for our vegetarian meals. Or we try to have animals that have less of that impact, including possibly looking for sustainable farming. So there's so much to think about there. And I definitely I'm not the sort of person who's like, okay, everyone, you have to make this choice. You have to become vegan. You have to become vegetarian. But I definitely encourage people to have a critical awareness of like, where is our food coming from? How can we, continue to honor our culture, but at the same time, um, honor the impact that we're having on this world and ensure that we are having as much as possible a positive impact.
Yeah, and with meat, there is hadith where Prophet ﷺ, the nearest meaning, talks about eating meat, but not at the extent that we do. Some of us
Mhm.
twice a day, three times a day, and I'm sure the quantity of meat that human beings eat today is much more than it was 50, 60 years ago. In entire human history, the amount of variety that we have in fish and meat is so immense, and so many different varieties. In history, mankind has never had this type of consumption and variety ever. And so, because of that, all the diseases we're facing today, cancer, heart disease, and all these things are exacerbated by the food choices. Now, we talked about, how food, whether it's overfishing, whether it's cattle. Let's talk about the role of technology and technological innovations that are coming down to reduce the cost of energy, and also the new technologies that are coming out to have even lab created meats and what have you. So wherever you'd like to start in terms of renewable energy or technological innovations to really combat these existential issues.
What a topic. I mean, I think that we are really lucky to be in a world where there's so much innovation and creative thinking about how, we can redesign our world with the use of tech. I was actually just reading this book called Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Colbert, and it's a great book. And she talks about all the different efforts that we have taken to try and engineer ourselves out of the climate change and biodiversity crisis. And for people who are interested in learning about tech, I think I would defer to the expert on that one, because she speaks about all of these different ideas, from carbon capture to like how do we address and keep alive certain species who are on the verge of being extinct using our technology and using science. And so I definitely I defer to her on that, and I encourage everyone to read that book. It's a fascinating read.
There is in a place called Squamish, which is near Vancouver. Bill Gates has funded a carbon capture company, which and then I was talking to one of the brothers that works for the company, and I said, we're in a province, in a city where the pollution is not as significant as India or China. And he says, what you don't understand is wind currents, is that pollution comes here because it's everything's interconnected, and the wind currents will come here. So I was like, so your technology for carbon capture will capture carbon from here that could come from all over the world. He says that's exactly it. So amazing technologies. Now, there are technologies, again, the leather industry, which is tied to the meat industry, or the cattle industry, and lab grown leather, lab grown meat, and even this shift to beyond meat. And I don't know if you've tried that.
Yes, I
Those.
have.
So let's talk about even those type of choices where technology is converging on creating unique innovations where we don't necessarily have to deforest the rainforest for cattle production, when we can grow our own meat in the lab, and also leather.
Yeah, absolutely. There are so many of those options that are available to us. Like Beyond Meat is one example, but there are all sorts of companies that are coming up with like new types of like vegetarian or vegan meat. And so I think that we are lucky to have that choice. And what I encourage people is to really leverage the power of consumer choice, because by choosing those alternatives, you're sending a message to industry that this is something that you care about. Likely, it's because you care about the environment, or you care about animals, or whatever your motivation is. It's sending that signal that we should have more of these options available, and that industry needs to shift to consider sustainability. So the more that we use those technologies, and the more that we speak out on those different options and recommend it to our friends, the better. And I hope that, especially my generation, I know that so many of us are taking up those options, and we're integrating them into our lives. And so the more we do that, the more we're signaling that industry needs to change.
Absolutely. And you brought up something earlier about innovations in farming and vertical farming. So
Yes.
the concept of farm to plate And one of the ways they're doing that is to bring the farm closer to the plate. Whereas in metropolitan cities like Toronto and San Francisco, Vancouver, where companies are doing vertical farming, where they can within greenhouses grow every kind of vegetable and fruit as one way to curb, the key aspects of the environment are also transportation. So if we can cut the transportation cost for foodstuffs and other goods dramatically, that will reduce greenhouse emissions. And so for sustainable farming, and as you said about your grandmother's green thumb, that these type of initiatives where historically people would grow their own vegetables in their backyard. And so let's talk about these innovations in farming and innovations in food security.
For sure. I mean, I am a passionate believer that one of the good uses of our time in the pandemic is to engage in gardening in your backyard, to support community gardening initiatives. I know people who have brought hydroponics into their lives because that's becoming more and more available at the individual level. And of course, always supporting our local farmers and as often as you can, like going to a farmer's market instead of a grocery store. I love to encourage that because absolutely, if you're choosing to get produce or get food that is traveled from a long ways away, it does have a carbon impact that is not so great for our planet. Another thing that I really love to push people to think about is we have so many expectations for our food, like that it looks a certain way, that it is a certain color. And there actually are a lot of organizations and small businesses that are combating that specifically and trying to rebrand like ugly fruits and vegetables and saying, hey, grocery stores actually throw this produce away because it doesn't meet your standard, but let's shift our standard back to eating things that are nutritious, that are sustainable, that are local, and not necessarily the things that just like seem as though they're the right color or seem as though they fit into your standard beauty. So I love those innovations that are happening within farming, but I also love to watch the innovations that are happening and how produce and food is being marketed to the consumer so that we can make those critical shifts in our choices.
And we're talking about a seismic shift in human behavior and the economy. And so, as we know, what drives industry is profits and revenue. And because we have in the United States Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the Green
Mhm.
New Deal, and to really shift thinking, because right now with this fossil fuel bottom line and major oil companies being the largest companies in the world up until the tech companies became the largest companies in the world, but to really shift the idea in entrepreneurship that there is something very significant and profitable to be in green industry and green tech. And let's talk about economies moving based on profits and revenues that can be attributed to shifting to green energy and sustainable and renewable innovations and products.
For sure. I mean, I definitely touched on this in terms of consumer choice, and ensuring that we're signaling to industry, to the private sector, to companies that we care about sustainability. That's one important part of it. But the other important part of it is signaling that to our governments. It's letting it be known that we're making choices on who to vote for based on the environment. That's a really important thing, and that in response, governments need to be thinking about integrating environmental principles and integrating, a choice to be green in every part of life. And a big part of that is the economy. It's, ensuring that they're subsidizing certain industries that are more dedicated towards sustainability and making sure that for us it's we're able to afford it, because we don't want to perpetuate, and I think this is something that happens, but perpetuate this cycle where the wealthy are able to afford the choice of sustainability, and those who are from lower income or middle income families are not able to afford that. That is an issue. And so making sure that that sustainable technology is cheaper, more readily available, is something that comes to the forefront when we're designing the Canadian economy. I think that that is really important. So yes, definitely both those paths of let's signal to businesses and let's signal to governments that this is the future that we care about and that we want you to create.
And with this type of advocacy, obviously we have the conservative government, the liberal government, the NDP, the Green Party. And Green Party, obviously, their platform is synonymous with the environment. And there are, again, some people in government that are climate deniers. In terms of advocating and policy, what are your strategies in terms of engaging government on behalf of the Muslim community and others?
Absolutely. I mean, we are a very new organization. We came about in December 2019. And so just like a little over a year ago. And so we've been spending a lot of our year setting up that groundwork and haven't been able to engage as much as we would like to. I think that's a future goal for our organization. However, what we have had the opportunity to do was to engage with Nature Canada. And they helped us develop a connection with Minister Wilkinson and Minister Bernadette Johnson, so that we can raise the importance of including diverse perspectives as they're thinking about the environment and designing environmental policy. And so we've started to create those conversations. And I think for any other new organization or individual who's just getting started, that is where it starts. It starts with that relationship building, and it starts with developing that trust. And with trust comes a greater capacity to challenge. And so that's what I encourage everyone to do is, like, if you have an idea, even if you're new, because we're so new as well, write to your elected officials, let them know that this is something you care about, and look to people who are experts on the issues. There's so much research in Canada. There are huge advocacy efforts in organizations who have been doing the work, and reach out, create those critical conversations, because there are power in numbers.
And the multi-layered approach, federal government, provincial government, municipal
Absolutely.
government, school boards, like right across the board, and then even the private sector. Now, you brought up another point, is diverse voices. So part of diversity, allyship. So although we are the Muslim community, but obviously the climate affects everybody equally. And so that is probably the most equal form of discrimination in the environment against all of humanity is working together with other diverse voices. So let's talk about allyship and alliances with other faith-based and race-based groups and other groups that have an aligned value system.
For sure. I think allyship is integral. It's number one. When we came into this space, we came in with an understanding that there were other organizations doing this work, and how do we ensure that we're working with them and aligning with them and collaborating with them and co-designing with them. And so for us, that was reaching out to Indigenous communities, reaching out to like Black and Indigenous organizations like Future Ancestors, trying to have those discussions about how can we work together. And I think a big part of allyship for us is hearing. It's listening and hearing to what has been done and what people are saying, because of course, as Muslims and as racialized folks, like, we have understandings of some perspectives for sure, but there are folks who have experiences that we cannot pretend that we understand. Like, I will never understand what it is like to be an Indigenous person in Canada and to experience that level of environmental racism and environmental injustice. And so it is so important to do the research, to listen to the voices in that space, to read books. I'm a voracious reader, and so I try to read as many books as I can so I can understand those perspectives, and reaching out to organizations who are also doing the work.
And where we were at was allyship and the First Nations community, Indigenous peoples. So, one thing I think people really don't understand, you touched on it earlier, was environmental racism. And it being that you're in Toronto, and Flint, Michigan is not far, where the water treatment plant is very, let's just say the water is very acidic and very toxic to the residents that are primarily Black and low income. So let's talk about what environmental racism is, and how systemic change is, because certain communities are more affected by environmental issues than others.
Absolutely. I mean, environmental racism is basically what happens when environmental burdens fall disproportionately on Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities. There are so many examples of it all across the world. I think for those who are interested in learning about the Canadian context, there's a great book called There's Something in the Water by Ingrid Waldron, and she wrote specifically about racism in Nova Scotia, including working with Black communities, something that I would recommend out. In terms of examples, it's something that is so broad. There's everything from dismissing Indigenous land sovereignty, so constructing pipelines on Indigenous land without their consultation. That's an example of environmental racism. Having increased environmental burdens in proximity to, Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities, and so that could be like creating waste dumps or toxic landfills or factories. Often those are disproportionately close to those communities, and they suffer from health repercussions from that, ranging from cancer to asthma. Environmental racism can also happen in subtler ways in terms of how our neighborhoods have been constructed, and this is something that's very clear in the US, but also happens in Canada as well, where there is better access to green spaces in communities that are white, to more beautiful spaces. And that is something that, especially in the pandemic, we know has an impact on mental health. If you can't access green spaces, urban parks, things like that, you're not going to develop that same appreciation of nature. But you also are going to have a toll because you're not going to have the space to walk through. One last example I'm going to say is that there is a safety issue that Black folks, Indigenous folks, and racialized communities experience in the environment. So, for example, there's like a long history that Black individuals have had to contend with of not feeling like they can be safe in rural spaces and in nature spaces for so many reasons. And unfortunately, as a result of a lot of violence that used to take place and continues to take place in those spaces. So it's also about keeping that in mind, and considering that everyone has a different relationship with nature, and often that relationship has been the result of a long history, including like colonial histories and histories of violence.
I'm actually listening to a book by one of the founders of Black Lives Matter, and what she was saying is that Black youth, because of not having access to parks and after-school sports that are in more wealthier Caucasian neighborhoods. So if 5 or 10 youths are just in an alley talking, they're viewed as a gang by police and disproportionately searched and thrown in prison. And so if there's no green spaces or parks, and then automatically you're assumed to be in a gang. So it is, again, a form of environmental racism by not having access to environmental spaces to appreciate parks and nature, and to really get that well-being that we get when we are in nature and connecting to nature. So now we're going to go from local to global. And so because we are intersectional and global in everything we're doing. So even if we get things right in Canada, everything else in the world affects Canada regardless. So one of the reports that came out recently that we got from, I believe it was the Yagin Institute, was that climate change is going to disproportionately affect Muslim majority countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Middle East, in Southeast Asia. So climate change is going to affect Muslim majority countries. So in terms of, we have climate activists like Greta Thunberg, who's very young, and other folks. And I would say it's almost like a reverse mentorship where youth leaders probably know more and are willing to act more on the environment, because you will inherit the world after the older generations are gone. So let's talk about global alliances, global partnerships, and working globally with alliances to kind of combat the climate crisis and emergency.
For sure. I mean, global alliances are critical in this topic. And I think you mentioned this earlier, but the world is interconnected. We can do something here that will have impact elsewhere. And that's true for all sorts of things, including with our carbon emissions. And so, yes, those global alliances are critical. I also think that one really important thing to note is that innovations are going to be coming from all around the world. And it's important within Canada to recognize that. If there is this great idea about how we can shift our thinking about sustainability and about integrating green principles into our industry somewhere else, we should also be thinking about how we can integrate that in our own context. And you also mentioned it, there are many people who have become global leaders in this space. I, of course, love Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and who doesn't? But she says so many important things about ensuring that, in thinking about environmental shifts and systemic environmental shifts needs to be integrated at every single level and in every single thing. And her Green New Deal is the manifestation of that. And so looking into those other examples that people are pushing forward and the work that's been done, I think that's so important. Yeah.
And we talked about entrenched, well-funded lobbies, and one documentary that really influenced our thinking was Oceanspiracy, which talks about overfishing, where 90% of species of fish around the world are more or less have been overfished, and many are about to go extinct. And then the other aspect is plastic. So plastic being tied to fossil fuels and packaging and rethinking packaging. So there's one thing in the documentary talked about, there was this big campaign about straws, which are 0.00002% of plastic waste in the oceans. But what we're not being told is 45% of plastic waste in the oceans are these large fishing nets that these major fishing companies use. So in terms of sustainability and packaging, which packaging is such a, we take for granted the plastic bag or the processed food that we buy, everything is packaged. So in terms of even solutions for homes and people to rethink packaging and rethink plastic, because this is such a detriment. And even the clothing we wear with the microfibers and the reports that we're reading is that even in the seabed, like with the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, is actually a small portion of the actual plastic that's been dumped into the oceans, and a lot of it is now being on coastal seabed. So let's talk about packaging and what we can do locally and possibly globally to combat this very, very, very important issue.
For sure. I mean, I think Oceanspiracy was a great jolt for a lot of people into thinking about the repercussions of their choices. I think that for me, and I guess this is my bias as an organization that cares about awareness and education, for me, it always comes back to critical thinking. It comes back to thinking about what are the choices that I'm making and what are the impacts of that on a system level. And I think if you follow that thread, like if you take clothing, for example, and you think, okay, where did this come from? What was the company that made it? What materials was it made? And you follow that thread, you'll eventually arrive to the conclusion that this is how the industry is perpetuating worse packaging. And so you can do that with everything. You could do that with, like, you could pick up an Amazon box in your home and trace that back to its origin. You can do that with food waste and the food that you're ordering in grocery stores and trace that back to the origin. And so that's an exercise that I recommend for everyone, because it really starts with recognizing that this is a systemic issue, and that unfortunately the choices that we make are they happen within a greater system that really is biased towards using heavy amounts of packaging. So I would start there for anyone who's looking to develop that understanding of why we're talking about packaging and why it's a systemic issue, and then move from there to action. And that could be anything from making those individual changes to joining in with efforts to lobby our governments at all levels to ban plastics or to rethink their relationship with fishing fishing, especially with trawlers, because, I think that there are some forms of fishing that it's possible to do well, like especially with small local fishermen, and with indigenous forms of fishing, which does integrate those principles of sustainability. And I don't want to forget those or lump them into that larger critique of trawlers. But yeah, it really comes down to thinking about it and then taking action.
And you brought up the trawlers, and for those that aren't aware, there are these gargantuan fishing fleets from Europe, from China, and from other countries that illegally fish in different parts of the globe. And according to that documentary, whether it's true or not, 90% of the fish caught is illegally fished. So that brings up another very key point: is climate refugees. And one of the issues in terms of the Somali pirates was because these fishing trawlers would take all the fish that was part of their livelihoods, so they had to resort to other extreme measures. And then in other cases, because their livelihoods are being taken away, they have to go to other countries and other places to create a living. And so climate refugees and the impact of all these aggressive capitalistic in the context of fishing and these fishing trawlers really wreaking havoc on certain countries that aren't able to fight back. So let's talk about climate refugees and the impact that will have, because this will exacerbate, according to the United Nations, currently there's 80 million refugees in the world today, and they're predicting by 2030, it's going to be 300 million. So, yeah. and a good portion are likely to be as a result of climate refugees. So that's a big, big issue, and it's going to be a bigger issue as we move forward.
For sure, it's definitely a big issue, and we've started to see those impacts, and they're going to continue to unfortunately rise as the ocean levels rise, especially for populations that live on islands, who live on the coast. They're going to really, really face the impact, or people who are even living on riverbeds, and the impact of that, of course, is going to be that forced dislocation, and the rest of the world is going to have to figure out how do we accommodate for refugees and integrate them into our society, because it's a travesty that people are having to face this dislocation.
Yeah, and so now let's wrap up with some hope for the future. Yes. We talked about a wide-ranging number of issues, and Marium, you're an inspiration to us because you are coming up with this great work with your team. So let's talk about hope for the future and some positive messaging for the folks at home, that it's not all doom and gloom. There is positivity here as well.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that there is a lot of hope here in Canada and actually across the world. I think Muslims have really awakened to the importance of our environment and to protecting our environment and engaging in a balanced relationship with our environment. And I think that as long as we continue to have those moments of awakening and those moments of recognizing that we do have a deep care and appreciation for our nature, and we should be fulfilling a role as Khalifas of this world, I think that there's lots of hope that comes out of that. I also think that there's a lot of hope because after last summer, there were so many conversations about equity, diversity, inclusion that were happening after the tragic and horrific murder of George Floyd. But I think that those conversations and that awareness has actually continued to have a positive impact, where our government is now really considering environmental racism for the first time. And maybe it's not yet at the level of politicians, but at the very least, Nature Canada and some of the bureaucrats have started to think about that and how we can incorporate diverse voices. And so I've had a lot of hope just from that. And then the last thing is our youth. I think we could always get so much hope from our youth. And I have a younger sister, and the level of education that they have and knowledge that they have about the environment is unprecedented. They really, really care about this, and they have so much creativity and energy and passion for how to change our world, and how to think about the development of new systems. In terms of where Green Ummah fits into that, we're launching our curriculum. It's going to be an entire curriculum that it's targeted towards, to youth and especially Muslim youth, but it's open to everyone at all levels who are interested in experiencing that journey of why is it that I care about the environment? Why is it that I think about the environment in the ways that I do? And what can I do with that new awareness of myself? And so it really, really centers self-reflection and then teaches methodology for how we could take action. And so I think that there's also hope that, organizations like us, not to pat myself in the back or anything, but that we are doing that work, and it's not just us, there are other organizations as well.
And we would love to share your work in your workshops virtually or in person here in British Columbia. So by all means, I think when we're ready to do that and promote it, we'd be grateful to promote that and get these workshops started here in BC.
For sure.
So in closing, and to plug the event that you'll be speaking at that we're all working on together. So in honor of World Environment Day, which is June 5th, and World Oceans Day, which is June 8th, Marium, you'll be speaking on behalf of Green Ummah. And so the purpose of this event, we're bringing allies and as a faith-based convener, voices from the Christian community, the Jewish community, academics from their respective fields in forestry and the oceans, and other related politicians that are supportive of this work. So that's going to be June 5th and June 8th, and it's called Saving Our Planet, Faith in Action. And Marium will be one of our speakers. So thank you, Marium, and looking forward to working with you in the future.
Great. Thank you for having me.